My name is Bill Dingus, and I want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon to think about a number of these issues that Steve mentioned. The way that we will proceed is that what I'm going to do is a kind of a background profile here. In point of fact, there's a good 70 years plus of social behavioral science research addressing the issue of Catholic disaffiliation. And what I want to do is give you a kind of a speed course, if you will, in relationship to what we know about this process of disaffiliating. And I'm going to do this by reviewing the literature in the pre-Vatican II era and the literature in the post-Vatican II era, and then asking ourselves the question, what's similar and what's dissimilar here? So that's how I will proceed. And my comments then will be followed by Father Byron and Chuck Zeck, who will tell you about a research initiative of theirs recently in which they interviewed 300 individuals who have left the church. So these are contemporaries, if you will, who have left, and they will share with us what they learned by virtue of this material. And then Peter Murphy, who is with the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, will offer a reflection on both my comments and the ones by Father Byron and Chuck in relationship to the new evangelization. This is something those of us that, in some sense, make a living sort of following what's going on with Catholics, the awareness that significant numbers of Catholics have left, disaffiliated, fallen away. Obviously, there are a lot of different words that we can use to describe this, and I suppose it does matter how we name this process. So, in one sense, this is not a big surprise, but certainly with this Pew Religious Landscape Survey, which had an N of some 33,000 people, Pew really got these numbers, if you will, out into a public forum, and since 2008, since this Pew data was published, and these were some of the figures that Steve was reciting, there has been a kind of growing discourse, if you will, certainly among Catholics, intellectuals, academics, what have you, and the blogosphere is full of all sorts of reasons, why Catholics are leaving the church. So, and our gathering to talk about this is another illustration, I think, of the kind of increased energy that this issue is getting among Catholics and in the church. And I feel myself that this is it's important for those of us that are Catholic to talk about this, because if we don't frame this issue, somebody else will, in terms of how this is described, what's going on, and so forth. Okay, so what I'm going to do, how did I get to this? Okay, so what I'm going to do here is to go very, very quickly, and I apologize for this just because my goal is to get through a considerable amount of material here, again, because I want to try to give you some kind of a background that I think is relevant to the rest of the comments that will be made today. So I will need to go quite quickly, and I know that's not pedagogically very sound, but I will do that, and we will have an opportunity then later for questions, comments, and so forth, okay? Did I inadvertently hit this? Oh, okay. So, anyway, this is a reiteration of the points that Steve made. 1 and 3, think about it. Pete Steinfeld's comments. Bill D'Antonio, esteemed scholar in the back. Some Catholics are strongly committed to the church, active in church life. The majority are not. Older Catholics are more committed than the young. The long-term trend, the level of Catholics' commitment to the institutional church from 87 to 2005, moderately downward on the basis of generational differences. We can predict a continued downward drift in the future. And downward drift would include the dynamic of disaffiliation in some cases, obviously. This is hardly a new issue. We aren't the first to have anxieties about the number of Catholics that may or may not be leaving the church and why they're leaving. John England sounded one of the first alarms, 1836. This was to the Central Council for the Propagation of the Faith. stating that the previous 50 years the church had, quote, lost millions of members in the United States. Now, I must say this is hyperbole. I mean, there weren't millions of Catholics at the time. So, bless the bishop. Let's take this as his sense of the urgency of the issue. Likewise, Bishop Bailey of Baltimore, this is a little bit later in the 19th century, summarized the situation of his day by lamenting that many Catholic immigrants flooding America's shores were among those who, quote, never practiced any duty of their religion, do not come near our churches, and are, in fact, entirely beyond our control. And I could go on with this. This is from a project that I've been working on for way too long that deals with the Mass among American Catholics, and I have lots of these kinds of quotes. As religion slowly lost its monopoly, this is now into the 20th century, a growing number of Catholics, like significant numbers of other Americans, were finding, quote, almost any excuse possible to stay away from church, a spiritual affliction humorously dubbed morbus sabbaticus in the Catholic press. This morbus sabbaticus is from the Ave Maria in 1935. And you'll see in a minute why this is important. The first, what I would consider relative empirical attempt to understand how many Catholics are leaving the church and so forth, what the scope of this problem is, was by Gerald Shaughnessy, a priest scholar, later Bishop of Seattle. Has the immigrant kept the faith? And he used in this book, in his research, he used government data. He tried to debunk what he saw as the myth of vast losses of Catholics among the immigrants. There were some losses among the Irish, especially those who had migrated to the South, but many of them were already Protestant, so in that sense, this was not a loss to the church. And pardon my self-indulgence here, but this is my great-grandmother. And you can't see this too. I mean, this is rosary in hand. We don't know when this photograph was taken. We think it was pretty much right off the ship, if you will. Okay, so I'm going to summarize for you, again, a lot of research that was done in what I'm calling this pre-Vatican II era. These are some, not the only, but these are some of the primary sources to which I'm referring. And you'll notice that most of this, it's in the 1940s when this starts to this kind of work really starts to take off, so to speak. And this was work done by the first generation of American Catholic sociologists. Most of those who did the research were themselves clerics or religious. They relied heavily on church sources, particularly diocesan and parish census records. And also, too, most of this research through the 40s and 50s was done during this so-called triumphal era in the church. And there's not a lot, with the exception of Joe Fichter's work, there's not a lot of research that's directly concerned with the dynamics of disaffiliation. There was sort of assumption that all Catholics were, connected to the church somehow or the other, whether they were going to Mass or not. And there are certain ways that you could infer things about why people were disconnecting by virtue of what you knew about what kept them attached. Okay, so again, by way of summary, the pre-Vatican II findings, I'm calling this the immigrant factor. Basically, this had two dynamics to it. One was in terms of institutional shortcomings in meeting the religious and spiritual needs of a rapidly growing immigrant population. And this has to do with insufficient numbers of priests, churches, schools, other organizational. This is what the literature often talked about in terms of why Catholics weren't practicing or left the church. The other, this ignorance or apathy, or as one person put it, the spiritual destitution, earmarking the faith of large numbers of Catholic immigrants who, though differing somewhat in their patterns of religious socialization, were often only semi-literate, devoid of formal theological sophistication, only loosely connected to the church's institutional structures when they arrived. Secondly, in all of this pre-Vatican II literature, the way being a practicing Catholic was marked. Being a good Catholic, being a practical Catholic, was understood almost exclusively in church disciplinary terms, and notably regular Sunday Mass attendance. That was the sort of marker of whether or not Catholics were connected to the church. They were Catholic because they basically acted like Catholics, which is to say they went to Mass, and this was also a kind of public signifier of membership in the church. This is also a period of time, again through the 40s and 50s, when there was a regularly high, the attendance rates were relatively high during this period. And it is the case, this is another story, but I will argue that this pre-Vatican II, post-World War II, pre-Vatican II era, where you have these rates in the 60, 70, 80%, this was a very artificial spiking of Catholic regular Mass attendance relative to what had been the case before that. And this is, again, quite evident, I think, if you look closely at what we know about the frequency of Mass attendance in relationship to the 19th century. And this had a lot to do with the fact that you had GIs coming home, getting married, having kids, having families. This was also a period of time, well, this was a period of time in which a lot of other Americans were going to church too. Now, there is one rather glaring exception here to most of this other data, and that's the work that Joe Fichter did in the Southern Parish, in which, in a much more sophisticated way in terms of how he did his research, showed that there were all kinds of variations, seasonal, in relationship to gender, in relationship to when Mass was held, that basically predicted how many people would be going to church at any given time. Over 40% of 14,838, these were white baptized Catholics in 3 parishes, were not attending on any regular Sunday basis. And these were people, again, those of you that are familiar with his work, this typology that he developed of the nuclear, modal, marginal, and dormant Catholics. These were the people that constituted this dormant group. So we're talking about a fairly large part of the population. Now, whether or not, what was going on in, if you will, the South and New Orleans area, to what degree you can validly generalize that this was true of Catholics as a whole across the United States, I don't know. I mean, that's a legitimate question. But this is what Joe Fichter reported in relationship to his Southern Parish study. Thirdly, out but still in, retaining a Catholic identity, going to Mass, well, yes, no, maybe sometimes. Even where people were disconnected, if you will, they tended to retain the faith, at least by virtue of the tendency to self-report as being Catholic. This is something that, again, strikes me as different. Protestants, by and large, Presbyterians who are not congregationally affiliated, who are not going to church, not registered, what have you, will typically, once disconnected, not continue to self-report when asked about their religious identity as Presbyterians. But Catholics have had this tendency that, in spite of being disconnected in all of the ways that you can be disconnected, continue to self-report or self-identify as Catholic. And so what's that about? The assumption was that leakage in the majority of cases related to shortfalls in discipline and observance, praxis, as opposed to apostasy. Why Catholics remain Catholic? Multiple reasons. Here are 4 of them. Ethnicity created a complex social ecology that carried Catholic identity to the degree that that social ecology, that ethnic dynamic was still at work. It sustained that identity. Where you have an enclaved ghetto population where there are more social pressures that are exerted to conform with behavior. The defensive posture of Catholicism in the face of historical anti-Catholicism, that's that old sociological axiom, external threat, internal cohesion. Catholic culture as a total weave of life that linked leaving the church and its communal ties. This is from Gary Wills, as I recall, this idea. Sheltered enclave in a single source of authority with a sense of betrayal. In other words, if you walked away from that, there was sort of a sense of betrayal in doing something like that. Other reasons, but these are some of the important. And of course, what's going on here in this post-war era is that, well, yes, these things are operative, but they're also breaking down. I mean, as assimilation is going on, these ethnic bonds are getting weaker. This enclave, Catholics are more socially mobile by virtue of GI Bill, better education, So this is transitioning, and it's affecting these factors. In addition to which, this is the point I was making before, after World War II, there were high degrees of social conformity, high levels of religious belonging, along with virtually all denominational lines. Relatively few Americans were leaving their denominational. So in that sense, Catholics at the time were sort of like everybody else. Fourth, significant social variables impacting church membership and participation. These were things, again, all of these studies pointed to this, and this is, in one sense, today's kind of common sense knowledge that women, by and large, tend to be more religious than men, therefore they attended Mass more frequently than males. Class dynamics affected frequency of attendance outcomes, whether they were native-born or foreign-born. And then the question of religious socialization, whether or not they went to Catholic schools or some kind of catechetical program. These were all things that this literature showed correlated with probability of frequency of church attendance, probability of remaining Catholic, and so forth. Family and marital status. This was a really big one, and there was a lot of attention directed to this. This parental neglect, again, this is a phrase that Fichter uses in his research, having interviewed these dormant Catholics. These were basically, at that time, 30% of Catholics who were baptized and never appeared again. And what happened? Parental neglect. In other words, where there was the parents, either they weren't sent to Catholic schools, the parents themselves were not practicing or practicing only once in a while, made little or no apparent effort to socialize the kids into the tradition, and so forth. So he talks about, he puts this under the rubric of parental neglect. There were also, and this is across the board, virtually no exceptions in this literature, consistent negative correlations between affiliation, membership in the church, and factors related to separation, divorce, or, again, Fichter's language, family disorganization. And also the mixed marriages, or those that were considered invalid by canonical standards. My own experience as a little guy in the 1950s growing up, this is long before I got Who Made Us, God Made Us, Why Did God Make Us, God Made Us to Know. Before I even got to that point, my sense as a little Catholic boy was of a bad Catholic, two things. This was a family that sent their kids to the public school as opposed to the Catholic school, and it was somebody that married a non-Catholic. Seriously, that was before I got the other parts of the faith and what have you, that was my cultural sense of what constituted a bad Catholic. And as those of you that are at least my age, you know that the church inveighed against this, mixed marriages and what this would lead to and so forth. Youth and young adults, there's little empirical evidence in this research that Catholic losses were perceived as a youth-oriented or young adult problem. This is one of the things that strikes me relative to where we are today in terms of thinking about Catholic losses now as a generational problem, as opposed to simply individuals that for whatever reason decided, they don't want to be Catholic anymore. And most of the explanations, rightly or wrongly, for this were that there were relatively strong mechanisms of social attachment, Catholic organizations, lots of sponsored activities for young people, and so forth. The only Fichter shows that where you start to get a dropping off in relationship to an age cohort is primarily in the when they're people that are in their 30s, and he attributes this to everything from sort of, preoccupied with family stuff, career, etc., and also practicing birth control at this point in it where they now have 2-3 kids, and this is, that's enough. And so this means then either going to church, not going to communion, or not going to Mass, or disconnecting. Alienation from church teachings, limited exploration of the ideal real gap between official church teachings and actual practice and belief. Again, in this pre-Vatican II literature, we don't know a lot about what that gap was in terms of what Catholics were officially supposed to believe and what, in fact, most of them did believe. And likewise, we know a little bit more about practice, but a little less about the ideal real gap in terms of belief. More information in Fichter's Southern Parish study. showed discrepancies between official orthodoxy and actual belief. And again, the context here is that this was a study done in the southern, in New Orleans. Was especially pronounced with regard to race relations, business practices, marriage, and divorce. This is where he found the biggest gaps. Pervasiveness of what he called a relative morality, that's sort of every man's ethics, if you will, or woman's ethics are their own. Birth control was an issue. I mean, this was something in which people told him that, they understood what the church taught, but felt that, God would understand the predicament they were in. And also, he talks kind of in conjunction with this discrepancy between belief, practice, and so forth. He talks about heavy-handed authoritarianism. About 40% of the dormant Catholics that he interviewed told him that the primary reason that they left the church was because of some kind of an experience that they had with a priest in terms of being heavy-handed or authoritarian or aloof. He uses different phrases. Okay, so summary. This affiliation is associated with this immigrant status, with the mass attendance issue, the loss of practice, not of faith, certain social variables, family situations. It's not seen primarily as a youth problem, and alienation from some church teachings at least. Vatican II. There's more post-Vatican II research as Catholic identity became more destabilized in the wake of Vatican II. There's more conflict, there's more contesting and polarization among Catholics. There's a greater availability of national survey data, GSS or NORC data. Also, you get more sophisticated research techniques. So in one sense, we know more in this post-Vatican II era by virtue of more research being done on this topic. So what are some of the findings? Again, the significance of life cycle patterns, like other Americans, comma out. Catholics tend to drop out typically in late teens, early 20s. It's associated with leaving home, reaching adulthood. In these ways, Catholics are not different from other mainline, certainly Christian traditions in the United States. Two related questions: do they return, and do they continue to self-identify as Catholic even though they don't return? And let me... Okay, so do they return? Well, the yes thing was, once a Catholic, always a Catholic. I am more inclined to think it ain't necessarily so anymore. And the reason that I think this is the case is because of, to begin with, a looser attachment to the church. The fact that the assumption, and Andrew Greeley wrote of this on more than one occasion, the assumption was that as they get older, they get married, they have kids, they'll come back to the church. And I don't think that that's necessarily operative because people are waiting later to marry. The number of marriages to non-Catholics is increasing, and the number of marriages that are to Catholics but outside the church has also been increasing. So I don't think we can automatically assume that those same kind of factors that may have worked in an earlier era are going to work today, that people will automatically come back, if you will. Mass attendance, decline in mass attendance is a core behavioral signifier. Fewer consider the obligation to attend Mass regularly a serious matter. Again, this is from recent polling data. What's the relationship between a changing perception of the Mass and declines in attendance? The second one, the minimal necessary attendance. I mean, to me, this is an empirical question. If you're a Catholic and you don't, it's not necessary to go to Mass every, how many times? And according to what criteria that one can authentically still claim being a part of this tradition? I'm not so convinced by the notion that there's some kind of a Catholic imagination, some genetic trait that's going to keep people as Catholic, if this is not nurtured in the context of liturgy and prayer together. Okay, there's also, again, this is an empirical question of to what degree people's, Catholics' perception of what goes on in the liturgy is changing and what effect that has or does not have on the probability of their attending, particularly when somewhere in the neighborhood of about a third believe that you can be a good Catholic without believing that in Mass the bread and wine actually become the body and blood of Christ. Social variable consistency, again, this is something common with the pre-Vatican II, that gender, class, ethnicities, these things all correlate with connectedness. Family and marital status, divorce, separation, dysfunctional, interfaith mixed marriages, and so forth. This stuff has remained relatively constant. Parental dynamics, religious preferences are more, this is the assumption here, the first one, religious preferences are more stable, although not guaranteed, across generations if reinforced by practice and belief in childhood. And then where individuals come from stable families, both parents are practicing Catholics, committed church members, they tend to remain Catholic, even when they have periods of church inactivity or late adolescence, or when they reject doctrines of, when they reject doctrines or forms of piety and devotionalism practiced by their parents. Okay? Family matters. Now, there's another issue here. I mean, I'm assuming this first one, there's something common-sensy about that, I guess, that, in some ways, children, even as they grow, will tend to imitate, if you will, be influenced by parental socialization dynamics. There's something else here. I'm calling this relevance of substratum psychological factors derivative of early childhood relations. And the short story here is that in the 1960s and early 1970s, there were a number of studies done of apostasy, disaffiliation. This is not just on Catholics. This was mainline traditions. And in essence, what they found was that people who, in adulthood, who disaffiliated more frequently from whatever particular tradition they had been part of, were individuals who tended to have more troubled relationships in relationship to their parents, as opposed to just whether or not the parents, socialized them into the faith or not. That there was something kind of psychodynamically in terms of attachment with parents. The Catholic version of this, or the person who studied this in relationship with Catholics, was John Cotras in a book called View from the Border. This is a very, very interesting book that I think deserves far more attention than it has gotten. Basically what he did was to interview 50 ins and 50 outs, 50 who stayed in the church, 50 who left, and did this very interesting sort of profile of what they had in common, how they were different, and so forth. Anyway, he also pointed out that the outs, that is to say those who as adults had left the church, tended to have experienced more parent-child conflicts and had less satisfying family relationships than those who were ins. So this was sort of the Catholic version of what some of these earlier studies on non-Catholics had shown in relationship to family dynamics. Whether or not Catholics leave the church reflects not only family religious socialization. I mean, again, that would be fairly obvious, I think. But according to these studies, apparently deeper psychological parental dynamics other than matters of religion or church. In other words, there's more going on here. For some individuals, tendencies towards religious disaffiliation appear to be as deeply connected to parent-child psychodynamics or rebellion against family pressures and parental relations as against institutional authority per se. So this is the kind of stuff psychologists would want to affirm or disconfirm, I suppose. But I'm reporting to you that is in the literature. Declining salience. All of these studies show that the importance attached to being Catholic has declined, although not precipitously, and especially so among younger age cohorts. Salience has to do with, we all believe all sorts of things. Pick an issue and I'll tell you where I am. It doesn't mean, of course, that we hold everything of equal importance. I have some beliefs that I think I would, go up against the wall for, and others I could be had, or I'm wobbly, or I'm not sure how I think. So in one sense, particularly when you're dealing with religious issues, it's not enough to know what a person believes. You have to know something about the salience. In other words, how central to that person's sense of who they are those beliefs and convictions. Indicators of declining salience. The thing that most interests me, this 87 to 2005, again, the church is the most or among the most important part of your life. Even in 87, this is less than half of the Catholics. What's interesting to me are the number who report drifting away or lack of interest or no particular reason, what I call the no particular reason syndrome, which I think, and in the Pew Religious Landscape Survey, it was some 71%. And to me, this is related to this question of salience. I mean, it's not a real issue that the church is wrong, or it's just not relevant. It just doesn't connect to my life. It's just not plausible in terms of, my economy of self, how I think about myself, organize my identity, and so forth. Some implications of declining salience. If it doesn't matter really, in the final analysis whether you're Catholic or not, it's probably not going to matter that much in terms of decisions about who one marries, in terms of how religious education is done, if it's done at all, whether or not somebody goes. I mean, what's important here is that there are behavioral consequences related to the salience of an identity. Increased probability of leaving the church or embracing a denominational perspective, being a cultural Catholic one. And what's intimated is that disaffiliation is not necessarily, in these cases, driven so much by principal theological issues or doctrinal differences as much as by a general loss of value, relevance, or plausibility. So this gets much more complicated than just, somebody doesn't like what's being taught, and that's the reason they're out of here. 6, the problem of intergenerational transmission of the faith. Again, this is the comment I made earlier about this, that in the pre-Vatican II era, there was a tendency to think about this in terms of individuals. Now it's being thought of and talked about more generationally. Disaffiliation as a kind of cohort effect. And again, I mean, there have been lots of reasons given for this, relating from everything having to do with internal factors, inadequate catechesis, how Catholics are socialized intergenerationally in the faith, to issues related to the American cultural gestalt, about which I will say something in a second here in a little bit. Alienation from church teachings. Again, this is in reference to this post-Vatican II stuff. The gaps have been biggest in relationship to the pelvic issues, birth control, homosexuality, same-sex marriage, abortion. Pew data show that when asked in their own words why they left the church, 50% cited objections to church religious or moral teachings, which is just a way to say the sort of importance people play on this, that this is a significant factor. A related issue is how church authority is exercised at all levels, and it may be that insofar as religions like politics, which is to say it's always local, what happens at the local level in relationship to the parish, the pastor, can have a very profound effect in terms of people being alienated from the church's authority structure. Interestingly here, and this is by way of, this is Pew data again, the sexual abuse hierarchical malfeasance scandal is a reason, but not the lone reason. There were only about 2 or 3% who gave this as the lone reason for why they left the church. My own personal sense of this is that what happens, I mean, obviously people directly affected by this is going to carry more weight. The other thing is that my sense is that what you have is a kind of cumulative effect. In other words, there's a long-term buildup of things people become more and more alienated and estranged by. And then something like this hierarchical malfeasance, sexual abuse thing becomes a triggering factor. That, that point in our lives where you get pushed over the edge, basically. Straw that broke the camel's back and all that. How central is estrangement from church teachings to Catholic disaffiliation? Well, this has to be weighed against all these other things in terms of, and I don't know that this is, I don't see this as an either or, there's just one of these things. The importance of social, psychological factors, family situations, the loss of salience, failed socialization, or this generalized sense of drift. Where disagreement is a factor in dropping out, the rejection centers primarily around moral and disciplinary teachings, not around central or core doctrinal ones. This is something that a number of scholars have made much of. There's also this idea that there's more latitude sort of internally for Catholics to dissent, which is to raise questions about then, if that's the case, I mean, would it be that if there were less latitude for dissent, you'd have even more people leaving than is the case? Michelle Dillon has written a lot about this. Her book on Catholic identity is a very rich sort of thinking through of how this dissent gets legitimated in the church. All right, I'm running out of time here. This is an interesting one, failure to meet religious or spiritual needs. Church's failure to meet, this is usually associated, if you look at this research, with 3 things. The lack of a sense of community. These are Catholics who have left. Stronger Bible focus. They wanted a stronger Bible, didn't get this in the church. and especially with a more authentic and experiential form of religiosity. I understand one community, I understand Bible focus. I'm still wrestling with what this experiential form means. Don Miller, Reinventing American Protestants. This is a study, this is a fascinating study of 4 of these mega trans-denominational churches in Southern California, Vineyard Ministries, Hope Ministries. Don Miller estimates that about 28% of those churches are ex-Catholics who have joined. And he claims that, and he interviewed many of these people, that absent from their experience of Catholicism was the intimacy with God that they found in a new paradigm church. That was the reason that they gave for joining. Leaving Catholicism analysis from the Pew Religious Landscape Survey, 71% reported that they left Catholicism because their spiritual needs were not being met. Catch me in the hall. Okay, so a few conclusions based on comparing pre and post. Catholic, these are not the only conclusions. These are just a few. And I will give you a handout which has my name and email so you can get in touch with me. That summarizes this. Catholic boundaries have become more porous and diffuse, less likely to be bounded by doctrine and discipline. This makes the question of who's in and who's out more problematic or challenging. There's no single law of social causality operative here regarding Catholic disaffiliation. Different people leave for different reasons, and I would add different people leave, in some cases, for multiple reasons. So if we're looking for a silver bullet, it isn't there. Catholic disaffiliation is more about personal change in spiritual lives, more related to how they feel about church than how they feel about God. Catholics today mirror the intergenerational, most common disaffiliation pattern in Catholics are not different. Salience is extremely important aspect of Catholic identity, of religious identity. Declining salience reflects a diminished sense of the value of a tradition's religious capital. This is from rational choice theory. When the value of membership is lowered or diminished, the impact is likely to be organizationally debilitating and to foster defection. It just doesn't matter that much. It's not that valuable to me. Social relations matter in the maintenance of religious preferences. Much of Catholicism's contemporary social ecology is hollowed out. As family life becomes less stable, social mobility increases. As they become more integrated into other spheres and develop more heterogeneous social networks, Catholics have become less embedded in social relations with other Catholics, and their faith is less experienced as community. Now, obviously, Latinos, ethnicity, that's another factor here, of which this may not be particularly relevant. This affiliation suggests one thing where the operative theological and religious assumption is that there's one true church and that all are false or incomplete. This affiliation suggests another thing when the above assumption is no longer operative. That's a kind of theological reflection on, and then there's all the stuff having to do with the American cultural gestalt, and each of these is another couple of hours. Skepticism about institutions of all kinds, family instability, American cultural code of individualism, identity construction. See, we're increasingly living in a cultural context, folks, in which people do not think of religious identity as something you inherit. It's no longer an ascribed status. It's a choice. And this mimics much of the kind of psychological dynamics of market capitalism in terms of how you build an identity. Also, an issue that needs to be very closely examined, I think, is the evangelical hegemony in American society, the degree to which Catholics have become more and more influenced by an evangelical, not so much mythos, but ethos. I think this relates directly to this idea of spiritual needs not being met, and how Catholic spiritual needs reflect more of what has traditionally been associated with evangelicalism in terms of feelings and so forth. So creatively and successfully responding to Catholic disaffiliation means making responsible distinctions about what you can do something about and what you can't do something about. Discernment is of the essence, and I apologize for running through this. Thank you very much.
My name's Bill Byron, and I came back here today and realized when I walked on the campus it was 20 years since I walked off this campus, having been president here from 1982 to 1992. So it's good to be back. If you're a former college president, an extinguished college president, you kind of appreciate the fact that guys like Jim Eunice still smile at you when you come back. I want to make two brief points, and then Chuck will get into some of the methodology, and then I'll get back for the summary. Point number one, you're all academics, most of you, and you realize that any academic with a letterhead and a file cabinet can start a center for the study of just about anything. And Chuck Zeck, an economist at Villanova University, decided in the wake of the clergy sex abuse scandals, which were so badly mismanaged, and the management problems that led up to the environment within which that sort of thing could happen, he decided to start a center for the study of church management at Villanova University. And he invited me to be on his advisory board. He had people like Kathleen McChesney. Well, I won't go into the whole name, but there were people who were interested in and experienced in issues of managing church affairs. So he started this program 7 or 8 years ago, and we've been at it since. And he and I have worked together. That's just point one, pre-note one. Pre-note two, a man named Larry Bossidy, who was longtime number 2 person at General Electric next to Jack Welch, a devout Catholic, now retired. He left GE to become the CEO of Allied Signal and later of Honeywell, one of the major CEOs in the United States. And as I said, a good Catholic. His home is in northern New Jersey. He wrote a book called Execution, and he said it's not about capital punishment. It's about getting things done in a business environment. He remarked in my presence about 3 years ago what you just saw about the Pew data. He said, if the stuff that the Pew Research Center is reporting about decline in participation in the Catholic Church, he said if the Catholic Church were a business, they'd be conducting exit interviews. You know, if you're losing employees or if you're losing customers, you want to see why they're bailing out. And that stuck in between my ears, and the more I thought about it, I said that's really a good idea, and it's something that Chuck Zeck's center is really set up to address, to apply the best practices of business into management problems in the Catholic Church. So I wrote an article that appeared in America magazine about a year ago. I forget the title right now, but, you know, has anybody thought about doing exit interviews in the church? And they got an enormous response to that, an enormous positive response. And Chuck and I began saying, let's look for a moderate-sized diocese, not too far. We're both in Philadelphia, not too far away. Wilmington, Allentown, Camden, someplace like that. And let's see if we can't do an exit interview project. First question is, how are you going to find the people? I'll address that in a moment. But then I bumped into David O'Connell, who was here as president. He's an academic, and he understands this sort of thing. And I told him, he had seen the article in America, and I told him that Chuck and I were going to pick up a diocese, and he said, how about my diocese, Trenton? And I said, sure, that'd be okay. So we went up and met with the Presbyteral Council, his priest advisors, and with him twice. I'll give you just one anecdote, then I'll go back to Chuck. The anecdote was this. We had a draft survey instrument. Now, this is not, high wire research. This is basic sit down and, what do you think? Let's get your views about things. And one of the things that we wanted people to fill out was the parish to which they were attached before they left. And when we met with the 30 or so members of the Presbyteral Council, there were 2 or 3 of the pastors who said, no, don't put the parish in there. And I said, look, if you were a General Electric and you were losing employees or losing customers, wouldn't you want to know whether those losses were in Singapore or in Schenectady? You really ought to know. So that was not a major, there was just that hesitation because obviously some people were concerned that some weren't going to look all that good. And I'll mention when I get into my presentation how we handled that project. But Chuck, let me give it to you right now, and then I'll be back with a summary of our results from Trenton.
Thank you, Father Byron. Those of you who are familiar with the Philadelphia area might note what a remarkably ecumenical effort this was. St. Joseph University in Villanova. I mean, tell about your mixed marriages. All right, don't start that now, all right? Yeah, so we got the permission of the Presbyterial Council, and we started advertising. First, they did an article about this in the Trenton Diocesan newspaper. Later, we advertised in the newspaper. We advertised in secular media. There's 3 major secular newspapers in Trenton. We advertised there. We advertised in a Spanish-speaking newspaper. And we had some priests, not all, but some priests who actually put a notice in their bulletin. And the notice said something, if you have left the church, or you know someone who has left the church, here's a study, here's your chance to speak out. And we made the survey available in a couple of ways. One, they could contact me and get a direct response. I would mail it out to them or send them by email. We also posted online on SurveyMonkey, and the vast majority actually responded online. That sort of surprised me. So we got the results, and I wanted to show what the results were. We actually got 298 usable responses. We had many more than that, but some came from outside the Trenton Diocese. And Bishop had kind of said, please just report back to me what's happening in Trenton. So some came from outside the Trenton Diocese in New Jersey. We had 1 response from Canada. We had 1 response from San Diego. We had 1 response from Australia. So I guess the word got out. As you can see, there are mostly majority women. Median and mean age are both 53, the range. And the racial composition, despite the fact that we made the survey available in both English and Spanish, we got 0 responses to our Spanish survey, either written or online, which has, frankly, been my experience with trying to do these sort of things. I want to make a couple of points. One, we guaranteed these folks anonymity. But at the end we said, would you like to have a priest contact you? And if you do, you have to give us your name and contact information. We'll still guarantee anonymity, but if you would like a priest to contact you, we'd have to know who you are. About 25 people did. So I contacted Bishop O'Connell saying, well, here, Bishop, here's the contact information for 25 people who would like to be contacted by a priest. I assumed he'd say something like, okay, I'll get one of my guys on it right away. But no, he said, I'll contact them, which I thought was a really good sign. I mean, I was really blown away by that, frankly, and I thought that was very much to his credit that he was going to contact them directly, because some of the comments were, frankly, very angry. A second point I wanted to make was that, as Bill had indicated during his presentation, Pew found that 71% of the folks who have left the church have drifted away. Okay, these folks didn't drift away. They gave us reasons why they had left. It wasn't really just drifting away. They gave us reasons why they had left. Thirdly, this is not a random sample. Rather, it's a sample of convenience. I can see my friends from CARA in the audience just kind of shouting at that thought. It's not a random sample? So we wouldn't do any statistical testing with it, for example. But I think for our purposes, it's much more useful. Because, again, a random sample would yield 70% of the people who just drifted away. But we're more concerned about folks who left for a reason, who voluntarily left and have a reason for leaving. And finally, you'll note, again, looking at the demographics, the typical respondent was a 53-year-old woman. And I would suggest to you that that's a very critical demography for the church. If we're losing 53-year-old women, we're at risk of losing their children and their grandchildren. So I think it makes a lot of sense to pay attention to what they have to say. Father Byron?
We're going to give you a set of notes in the America Magazine, April 21, 1 month from now. There's going to be an article on this, and the title of the article is Why We Left. Subtitle, Exit Interviews Shed Light on Empty Pews in Trenton. So you can look for this in America. It's going to be a summary. What I would like to do right now And, I'm one of these guys, I don't really care about PowerPoint. I'm just going to give you a highlight. I'll mention what the questions were as we went through. As we went through the survey instrument, it was not at all very extensive. We asked for age, we asked for sex, we asked for marital affiliation, and that sort of thing. But then we said, have you separated yourself from your parish, from the Catholic Church, or both? And an overwhelming number of respondents said both. About a quarter of those who replied said they had separated themselves from the parish, but still considered themselves to be Catholic. And one respondent wrote, I'm quoting, I separated my family from the Catholic Church and turned to an alternate religion for a while, and then returned knowing I had the right religion but the wrong people running it. Now, several chose to specify that they separated themselves from the hierarchy, which is interesting. The second question was it a conscious decision on your part to stop attending Sunday Mass regularly? Chuck alluded to that, the question adrift. A fair amount of ambivalence is exhibited here. Relatively few in our sample indicate that they simply drifted away. Some indeed still attend Sunday Mass on occasion, but most comfortably or uncomfortably identify themselves loosely with the institutional church. Now here's one of the responses to that question, and it highlights the ambivalence. Was it a conscious decision? Yes and no. I felt deceived and felt undervalued by the church. I didn't understand certain things about the church and found no mentors within the church. I just stopped going because my community of friends and family were no longer in the church. That was a young female aged 21. Another person said, yes, it was a conscious decision. Too rigid on divorce. Also, the arrogance of denial over sexual abuse of minors, and that was by a divorced and remarried white male age 62. A third who said, yeah, conscious decision. Yes, I was angry on a daily basis with the church, and all they wanted was money. We had a number of comments. I'm not going to give you all these answers, but a number of people said they just talk about money too much. And they talked about the quality of homilies not being great. And they said when it's they drop the homily and talk about money if it's a fundraising thing. All right, the third question. Are there any changes your parish might make that would prompt you to return? Now remember, this was just open. The people could write whatever they wanted, and I'll give you some indication. People welcomed the opportunity to express their opinions. There is no easily discernible trend here. While considering what they have to say in these bulleted responses that I'm going to recite just a few of them in a moment, give some thought to finding ways for all Catholics to put their views somehow on the record with an assurance that they will be heard. That's something that ought to be done right now, apart from this. I used to be pastor over at Holy Trinity Church in Georgetown. And that's a good parish, 9,500 parishioners, half of them from Northern Virginia. Jerry is laughing. I decided that we would have a homily evaluation on a random basis. And in the pews, there would just be a piece of paper like this, and you'd be asked to identify what Mass you attended. You didn't have to know the name of the homilist, just say, I was there on the 20th of whatever for the 11 o'clock Mass. And then the homily was excellent, very good, good, not so good, poor. Just check one off. I could hear it easily, with difficulty, hardly at all. Where were you sitting? I was in the back left, back right. So if there was a question with the main point of the homily was fill in the blank, A word of advice I might have for the homilist would be fill in the blank. And then, there were a couple of more little items and just said, thanks for your cooperation. Just drop it in the collection basket or mail it. No need to sign it. An overwhelmingly positive response on those people. People were on those forms. People were just glad to be asked. They were grateful to be asked, and of course, you learned something. You got some pretty good advice. All right. Again, to the question: are there any changes your parish might make that would prompt you to return? Here are just a few of them. Be accepting of divorced and remarried congregants. That came up a lot. Another, a visit by the bishop to apologize for sending father, name was mentioned, I won't mention it here, from parish to parish, and ultimately trashing the name of a parish. Another comment, I'm looking for more spiritual guidance and a longer sermon. Another, return to more consultative and transparent approach. These are the things that if they were to happen at the parish, that would bring people back. Now, as I say, there were a lot more than that. I'm just giving you a taste of what people said. One, change the liberal progressive political slant to a more conservative work ethic atmosphere. Then you had the other people saying, let's hear it from the left. So you got left and right. As I say that, I just want to mention as a cautionary note, and this would be, again, to the bishop and the priest, their immediate response is, oh, nothing new here. We can figure it all out. There is a lot that's new here, and there's a lot that should be paid attention to. You can't let what is an internal denial prop up and say, we've already heard it. You've got to listen. You've got to respect it. Provide, better music and more relevant homilies. Provide child care and children's ministry. Give us an outwardly loving, kind, Christian Catholic pastor. How do you like that? And that name of the parish was listed there. All right, question 4. Did you find the pastor at your most recent parish to be approachable or welcoming? Interesting response that we got. The question drew many enthusiastic, positive responses, as, for example, absolutely, very much so, yes, absolutely. And then they mentioned some great guys, very approachable. Yet, and by the way, we gave the bishop a hard copy, probably about 6,000-word report where all of the names were mentioned, parishes, names of clergy, and so on were mentioned. Then we gave him an electronic version of that and said, if you want, you can delete the name of a parish or delete the name of the person just out of sensitivity if you go and make this report public. Now, he told me about a month ago he was going to release it within 2 weeks. He has not yet released the report. And I'm waiting to see when it is released whether indeed all of it is there except these specific names, because we told him not to delete other things, to use it all. He took a few hits himself, and it will be to his credit if he lets those hits stay in the report that goes out. Now, it must be said that about half of the respondents were not enthusiastically supportive of their pastors. Some were pointedly negative. I'll give you just a few examples. He is not only unapproachable, but he takes the attitude that he could care less about you as a human being, let alone a parishioner. But it has been like this in this particular parish, and the parish is named, for decades. Nothing has changed for the better. Okay, you ought to hear that. He's a relatively new bishop, and he ought to be able to go to the incumbent pastor and say, this is what somebody who used to be in your flock is saying. Another one, the pastor at parish is named, seems condescending, unapproachable, and overly concerned with the appearance of the church campus. Another, approachable only at times, certain times with certain people. Disagree with him, and you are ignored. Another one, again, Did you find your pastor approachable? Absolutely not. He's formal, stiff, and pompous. He definitely carries a holier-than-thou bearing. Another one, I won't bore you with more, but no, we never see him. All right, there were very candid responses, and those responses have been delivered to the bishop, and now the bishop, in his own way, you know, he's got clergy personnel that he has to be concerned with. He can relay that on. Question 5. Did you find the pastoral staff at your most recent parish to be approachable or welcoming? And most respondents said they were positive or at least neutral on that question, although many said that they had little or no contact with the parish staff. Here's a sampling of the negative replies. Absolutely not. They are not welcoming. When you call or stop by the parish office, it's like you're bothering them. Another one, they refused to send me the weekly parish bulletin while I was on vacation, even though I gave them a stack of 8 stamped, self-addressed envelopes. Another time, couldn't stand staff at St. fill in the blank, especially the CCD director, a nasty man. And then another one, every time I contacted the office at St. so-and-so, the women answering the phone were not that nice. In a pre-study I did to this is not Trenton, with another diocese, a woman said to me, I called the parish to get an appointment to see the pastor. And the person on the phone said, what do you want to see him about? And I said, well, I'd rather discuss that. She said, well, look, when you figure out what your problem is, call us back and we'll give you an appointment. Now, you know, I'm not making this stuff up. It's incredible, but this goes on, and to let this surface, first of all, to let the people ventilate who themselves have experienced this, and then to get it through, it might have some help. Question 6, did you ever really consider yourself to be a member of that parish community? That's a very important question, because identification with the community is really important. A lot of the sociological studies will demonstrate that. Now, by a margin of about 2 to 1, respondents said they did consider themselves at one time to be part of a parish community. And I'm going to give you just 2 interesting replies that were elicited by this question. One person said no. As much as I wanted to get involved and expand my faith, there were no clear avenues to do that. So it was just a place to attend Mass. And because attending Mass was a guilt-ridden obligation, I was always alone in a crowd where I knew no one and no one knew me. Almost poignant. And then a second in that same vein, I did not experience community in the sense that I knew people just from going to church. The ones I knew them outside of church. No one misses the fact that she and her husband, that we stopped going. No one has called from the parish, even though we were regular attendees and envelope users. Nobody misses them. All right. Question 7. Are there any religious beliefs or practices specific to the Catholic Church that trouble you? Of course, let me just start giving you some of the answers. Yes, the Church's views on gays, same-sex marriage, women as priests, and priests not marrying, to name a few. Another, pedophile priests and brothers. Another, hypocrisy, history of discrimination against women, anti-gay stance, unwelcoming attitude. That was from a young woman. Let me get my fingers moving. Okay. I'm not going to give you, I have a whole list of bullets response to this question. But the stance on divorce was mentioned, as was bishops covering up child abuse and transferring offending priests to other parishes. Another one had the immigration. This was on the wrong side of the immigration issue, but it was mentioned here. Clerical privilege was mentioned. Another, it's all about money. That's why we left. Still another, the Catholic Church as a whole is ritualistic and cold. I do not get the sense of family and community that I get from another faith community, I get the feeling that God is judgmental and harsh, unforgiving, and unyielding. I could give you a lot more, but I won't delay. Let me just see. One guy said, and I love this one. I want to make sure I'm not skipping a page here. I am. Here's what I want. This next question, 8. Generally speaking, have you had any bad experience with any person associated with the church? Now, it should be noted that most respondents said no. They personally had no bad experience with anyone associated with the church. And here's a summary of what others said. Father so-and-so stealing money from our parish. Well, yeah, that would be one that would get their attention. My parish, and the parish was named, made it so difficult for my daughter to marry a non-Catholic that she married outside the church in another state and is no longer a practicing Catholic. Years ago, I was berated by a priest in confession. He was intoxicated. He screamed and yelled at me for using birth control. I felt like I was the worst person in the world. I have not been to confession since. Whole lot of answers, and I'm going to jump to one that I really like. Ask a question of any priest, and you get a rule. You don't get a let's sit down and talk about it response. Ask a question. I told Tom Green, who teaches canon law here, I had lunch with him today. He's a canon lawyer. And I said, I want you to hear this, because the canon lawyers are the ones that are dishing out the rules. But this guy said, ask a priest in this diocese a question, you get a rule. You don't get a let's sit down and talk about it. Well, that's what they've got to do, sit down and talk about it. And finally, there were a lot of, knocks on the priests, and I'm not saying undeserved, but a lot of comments about pomposity and lifestyle and removal from the realities of everyday life. Arrogant, judgmental priests. Everything that is wrong with the church relates to ignorant, arrogant priests. Then the last I'll mention, today's priests spend too much time on themselves, are generally obese, and do not live up to the standards of the priests of old. Question 9. If you could communicate directly with the bishop, what would you like to say? Now, this was an interesting one. Some people said, I tell him to go to hell. We didn't include that in the write-up. But there are a lot of helpful commentary that come through. And it suggests that we said to the bishop, you might want to find a forum for direct one-on-one communication, maybe by email, pick your means, one-on-one communication between parishioners and you, if not from you to them. Whatever is received, however, by mail, email, or other means should be acknowledged and respected. Whatever is received should be respected. What did some people say? They really liked the idea of being able to sit down for 5 minutes and tell the bishop what was on their mind. One said, the church should not condemn gays, but embrace them as God's people. The church should also recognize women as equals. Another respondent said, I'm disgusted with church leaders who knew of the obscene practices of priests and brothers and did not censure them. A third, beg forgiveness and apologize, this person would say to the bishop. And then another, please find a way not to exclude me from the Catholic community, a divorced white female, age 56. Another said, the poor were Jesus' first priority. And that came through. A number of people had kind of a social justice agenda. I am outraged, said one. and this person would want to say this to the bishop. I'm outraged that the bishop took church money to buy himself a very expensive home far from his cathedral at a time when the diocese is closing churches and schools for lack of money. I don't give to support the bishop's lifestyle. I give to support the poor. I can't afford to live in the neighborhood where he lives. Neither can 95% of his constituency. A number of things along those lines. Good to hear. Good to hear. Maybe not all that welcome, but good to hear. Let me just move on here and catch you up with, I got a whole additional page of comments on that. I won't, but let me take you to question 10. Do you now consider yourself to be a member of another faith community? If so, name it. Before I do that one, let me give you just one other answer in that last set, what I would say to the bishop, because this, I think, is helpful. You have my sympathies, Bishop. I couldn't imagine stepping into a management situation with such glaring human resources weaknesses. Perhaps you should have your priests live together in regional centers so that they could be more they could be psychologically healthier as a result of more human interaction. Also, do something about the quality of Catholic education. All right, moving on. Again, this is question 10. Do you now consider yourself to be a member of another faith community? If so, name it. The vast majority of respondents said no. They did not now consider themselves to be members of a non-Catholic faith community. Some did, but the vast majority did not. And here are what some people said in response to that question. I would stay in the Catholic Church if they would be accepting of my entire family, but because of my divorce and remarriage, they are not. Another said, I tried going to St. Paul's Lutheran Church several times and a couple of other churches, but it did not feel right. They were very friendly, though, more friendly than Our Lady, Queen of Peace. A third, I consider myself a believer in the Lord. To put myself in a certain denomination, I cannot. I love the tradition of Catholicism. However, something needs to change with the Sunday Mass. Now, another one said, yeah, I'm another one. I'm a Buddhist, this one said. I'll mention the spectrum over which they move. But anyway, they were essentially the 10 basic questions, and they're a sampling of some of the answers. Let me give you our analysis and recommendations, and then we can move on from there. Now, considering that these responses came by definition from a disaffected group, it's noteworthy that their tone is overwhelmingly positive. That is noteworthy. It's a disaffected group by definition, but the responses were positive in the main. That the respondents appreciated the opportunity to express themselves is something to be underscored. And then you might say, well, how about those that are still in the boat? They may want to have an opportunity to say what's on their minds. And that some of their recommendations could have a positive impact on diocesan life. Many of their recommendations could. Now, throughout our involvement with this project, as I mentioned before, Chuck and I thought of the negotiable and the non-negotiable issues that would surely be raised. And not surprisingly, the Church's refusal to ordain women, to allow priests to marry, to recognize same-sex marriage, and to admit divorced and remarried persons to reception of the Eucharist surfaced, as did contraception and a host of questions associated with the clergy sex abuse scandal. But on those doctrinal issues that surfaced, are all of them non-negotiable? We would recommend that all the concerns expressed be received with pastoral understanding, and a list be made of topics that require better explanation. Bear in mind, however, we say to the bishop, the words of one respondent who said, every time you ask a question, you get a rule. It's not necessary to repeat the rules. It's time to offer more reasoned arguments and better pastoral explanations of points of Catholic doctrine and practice that appear to be troubling people in the diocese. Now, notable among these, the issues that are troubling them are the exclusion of women from ordination, the perception that persons of homosexual orientation are unwelcome in the church, the complexity of the annulment process, and the barring of divorced and remarried persons from the sacraments. Now, we do not, however, recommend that these issues emerge as constituting an immediate agenda for a pastoral response, sort of like a defensive posture. In need of immediate attention is a fresh explanation of the nature of the Eucharist. Underlying all the opinions that were expressed in responses to our survey, all the opinions expressed by our respondents, underlying that is the fact that the respondents are willing to separate themselves from the celebration and reception of the Eucharist. Now, this calls for a creative, liturgical, pastoral, doctrinal, and practical response as an explanation of the Sunday obligation, as an obligation to give thanks. Remember the old American vernacular? Much obliged. Much obliged. That was a way of saying thank you. Well, the Sunday obligation means we are much obliged to give praise and thanks through sacrament and sacrifice, rather than simply to be present in church at Mass on Sunday. And it would be worth working that through. And talking about Eucharist in very pastoral terms, that Jesus said, in effect, here's how I want you to remember me: as bread broken, passed around for the nourishment of others. I want you to remember me as a cup poured out. And by the way, I expect you who want to follow me to be yourselves bread broken and passed around for the nourishment of others. I want you to be cups poured out in service one to another. That's what it means to be a Christian. That's what it means to be a Eucharistic community. We've got to do that. Now, the quality of preaching needs attention. That was mentioned. I didn't catch it in some of the bullets that I outlined, but it really does need attention. So does the image of the clergy, who, fairly or unfairly, are all too often seen as arrogant, distant, unavailable, and uncaring. One of the comments I had, and I didn't repeat it here, I just missed it. A woman said, I'll tell you what did it for me. She said, my pastor refused to go to the cemetery to bury my 9-year-old son because it was a non-Catholic cemetery. Now, I didn't make that up. That happened. And that sort of stuff is remediable. It can be done, and that guy ought to be on the carpet in a pastoral, gentle way. The bishop ought to be talking to him. Also, the quality of the sound system in the churches and the ability of foreign-born clergy with heavy accents to be understood. This is an issue that comes up. I remember a guy said to me, tell you what, tell the bishop to just go around, sit in the back pew randomly on Sunday and listen. See, Bill Graham, remember Bill Graham was here. He used to run institutes for priests. Bill Graham succeeded Gilbert Harkey as the chairman of the drama department here, and he used to give preaching institutes. That is badly needed. Another practical matter related to the pulpit is the frequency of appeals for money during Mass in Trenton, and we hope that they go down. Over at Holy Trinity, we used to have the annual Sermon on the Amount. We did. And I didn't start it. Larry Madden, who was pastor before me, started it. The Sermon on the Amount. And it was just once a year, and there was full disclosure with handouts of the finances of the parish, and then accountability. We were a tithing parish. 10% came right off the top and went to the poor, and a committee of the parish decided where it was going to go. But you do it once a year. Once a year. You don't harangue people all the time. Now, I'm almost finished. We have the impression from various replies that the diocese relates geography, meaning territorial considerations, to parish membership. Some of the, quote, bad experiences reported refer to refusals on the part of clergy to visit and anoint sick persons who live, quote, outside the parish. Similar issues associated with funerals, baptisms, and weddings might be avoided if the diocese permitted parish selection based on personal preference rather than location of real estate. In other words, a free market play. Go where you want to go. Cardinal Hickey, to his credit, here in Washington, did it that way. Go ahead. Go where you want to go. And then set up a healthy, even holy competition with people who might pay a little more attention to their homilies and to the quality of music and all of that. Okay, finally, the people. Not only those who responded to the survey, but all Catholics in the Diocese of Trenton would probably appreciate an apology from their bishop for any failures of the past, especially sexual abuse of children by priests or diocesan personnel, along with a pledge of accountability and availability in the spirit of servant leadership. This is what we gave to the bishop, and he has taken it to his presbyteral council. He told me that he was going to make it public. He told me he was going to do that some weeks ago. He has not yet done that. But we're waiting to see, and presumably this will be available on the website. We'll just wait and see. And we advised him to delete names that could be embarrassing to priests or parishes, and I don't apologize for that. I told him I would not interview him, and I didn't want to hear anything from him about this. Let it go. And I said, when the article appears in America, I said, if you have any differences of opinion, to his credit, by the way, we gave him the option of saying, if you don't want Trenton to be named, we'll just say a mid-sized East Coast diocese. He said, no, mention it. So fine, we mention it. And if he has any comment that he wants to make on any of this, he can do it the way you can do it, through letters to the editor of America Magazine. We think, Chuck and I have two other dioceses that have asked if we could do it for them. We think once that article appears in America next month, that we're going to get a lot of requests. And we think that it would be wonderful if that happens, and it would be really for the good of the church. I will end it there. Do we want to take any questions or any of this on that? Or? Yeah, okay, Peter's going to speak, and then we can open it up. Thanks for your patience and your attention.
Thank you very much, Father. As Father mentioned, I'm Peter Murphy. I'm the Executive Director for the Secretariat of Evangelization and Catechesis at the USCCB across the street. And I'm glad to be here today. Thank you, Dr. Dingus, for inviting me. And thank you also for your research, Father Byron, Dr. Zek, also that your reports and information is very enlightening. It's just such kind of data that provides inspiration and direction for the new evangelization, which is exactly what I was asked to do today, was to integrate the emerging concept that's been around for almost a few decades now of the new evangelization with the research that was presented today. And how do the two come together? And as I was preparing this and brought the two together, I thought they came together and coalesced very well. One, Dr. Dingus's information gave a real longitudinal look at the history and what was taking place, while the study in Trenton really provided some flesh and blood comments and critiques and some real needs that are emerging in the church. And so the two went really well together, and how the new evangelization will address some of these issues, and how, particularly through the words of the Holy Father, how those two come together in the new evangelization. While some of the research and statistics may be startling, it also provides that necessary understanding in the cultural context in which the new evangelization is taking place. And so it needs to be understood first and foremost, so that genuine questions, genuine needs can be addressed. I'm particularly grateful to talk about the new evangelization because the new evangelization really offers the church, each country, each diocese, and each parish a unique opportunity to look within itself and discover new means of fostering a love for Jesus Christ and a confidence and a desire to share the gospel with others. The studies highlighted some of the fault lines there, some of the struggles that will come along, and we'll discuss those in a little bit more detail. Today I'm just going to briefly discuss the cultural context in which the new evangelization is taking place, highlighted by the previous speaker's research, recent papal statements about the new evangelization, and again, in light of the research, proposed new evangelization initiatives in the United States. The Apostolic Exhortation on Evangelization in the Modern World by Pope Paul VI situates evangelization at the heart of the church. The Holy Father noted, "Evangelizing is in fact the grace and vocation proper to the church, her deepest identity. She exists in order to evangelize." The historical and social circumstances of the 20th century prompted the church to renew her mission to evangelization through reproposing the good news to all the Christian faithful. In the apostolic letter Porta Fidei, Pope Benedict XVI states, "Today, too, there's a need for stronger ecclesial commitment to the new evangelization in order to rediscover the joy of believing and the enthusiasm for communicating the faith. This rediscovery involves renewed joy in believing, a desire to share the faith, as well as the challenge of the new evangelization, which is to help people live, love, and share their faith." The new evangelization offers a one-on-one encounter with the person of Jesus Christ, and a call to each one to deepen our own faith, to have confidence in the gospel, and to possess a willingness and enthusiasm to share the good news with others. Through the new evangelization, the Church in the United States seeks to strengthen both the evangelizer and those being evangelized, so that all Catholics will experience the power of the Holy Spirit in their lives. In the Acts of the Apostles, we see St. Luke describing the transformative power of the Holy Spirit. He says, you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, and you will be my witnesses to the ends of the earth. The disciples' fear was changed into a courageous witness. So what is the cultural context of the new evangelization in the United States that was highlighted by the research today? The new evangelization, first of all, calls all Catholics to be evangelized themselves. As we see, that's a desperate need from the research, that Catholics themselves need to appropriate their own faith. What is this sense of Catholic identity? What makes us different from others? What makes a Catholic, what's unique? And while the new evangelization is directed to all people, it focuses specifically on those Christian communities who have Catholic roots, but who have, quote, lost the living sense of the faith, or even no longer consider themselves members of the church, which is exactly what we've been talking about today. The sense that, where is the church? How am I a part of the church? What does in and out mean, actually, as Dr. Dingus highlighted? And what does that mean for the new evangelization? The history of the United States is one of Judeo-Christian heritage. Yet as the data today reveals, these roots and societal supports for faith are being diminished and in some cases lost to the influences of secularism, materialism, relativism. Dr. Dingus's research indicates that Catholic identity is no longer supported by ethnicity or a Catholic culture and lifestyle that's unique within society and encourages a social adherence to the Catholic principles. Each of these factors helped Catholics in the past maintain a Catholic identity even when they stopped practicing the faith. New ways to support and reinforce Catholic identity are needed to help Catholics realize how they are unique. It's important to highlight what Catholics do and believe that make them distinct. Pope Benedict XVI states also, only when the faith permeates every aspect of their lives do Christians become truly open to the transforming power of the gospel. When one's faith informs their daily life and actions, they possess a strong Catholic identity. Catholic identity includes what is more than just weekly Mass attendance. The data reveals that some Catholics have lost a sense of what makes them unique. Some even no longer associate weekly Mass attendance with, quote, being a good Catholic. So fostering and strengthening Catholic identity and helping Catholics realize how faith and life intersect are vital components of the new evangelization. Faith is the essential foundation that invites a person to live out the Church's beliefs and seek to share the saving message of Christ with others. When someone truly believes the gospel and realizes how Christ has transformed their life for the better, they wish to share this pearl of great price with others. When a Catholic is confident and enthusiastic about his or her faith, sharing the joy of that faith is easier and not looked upon as a burden as much as sharing a gift that one has received. The task of the United States, as in other countries of the world, is to better understand the cultural context confronting our people and the Church in the 21st century. The 2010 CARA study, Sacraments Today, Belief and Practice Among U.S. Catholics, indicates that only 23% of Catholics, United States Catholics, attend Mass each week. The 77% absent from the Eucharistic feast are baptized, and many were catechized, yet they drifted away from the Church for a variety of reasons, as was noted in the survey, for a wide variety of reasons, but often there is a reason underlying. CARA indicates that the percentage of Catholics regularly attending Mass each week has held steady for a decade, and that efforts to re-engage the majority of Catholics who do not attend Mass each week or have stopped attending Mass altogether is a challenge. Some parishes to confront this challenge have begun mailing invitations, door-to-door campaigns to invite registered parishioners to return to the parish. A personal, cordial, and sincere invitation can go a long way to helping others desire to return to the sacraments. The 2010 CARA study and the data shared today both affirm that the most common reasons given by Catholics who do not regularly attend Mass are not often related just to controversial issues. The reasons instead point to a gradual slipping away from the faith. Or as Dr. Dingus indicated, it may be an accumulation effect. In the United States, Catholics who stopped attending Mass did so because they have busy schedules, family responsibilities, health problems, or conflicts with work. Others do not believe missing Mass is a sin, or they do not believe that they're very religious people. In other words, many Catholics have simply drifted from the Church because of the busyness of life and the changing cultural influences by secularization, materialism, individualism. This thinking is commonly expressed as, I'm spiritual, but not religious. The connection between formal religion and spirituality has been lost, and that the new evangelization will have to confront that question as well. The new evangelization in the United States is an invitation for people to experience God's love and mercy through the sacraments, especially through the Eucharist and penance and reconciliation. The Church must work to meet the deep spiritual inclinations and desires of people. Rich liturgy, engaging homilies, good music were identified by the exit interviews conducted by Father Byron and Dr. Zeck. Understanding and experiencing the sacraments in a new way will help meet the spiritual longing. Vibrant parish life will also support in sacramental practice, along with meeting a social need for people to connect with and identify with the larger Catholic community. Welcoming, friendly, and vibrant parishes will attract and hopefully retain parishioners while affirming their Catholic identity. The 2002 Bishop's Statement, Go and Make Disciples, a National Plan and Strategy for Catholic Evangelization in the United States. The plan states a sincere desire to invite all of God's children to their place in the Church and in the sacramental life. The document states, we want to let our inactive brothers and sisters know that they always have a place in the Church, and that we are hurt by their absence, as are they. We want to help them see that, however they feel about the Church, we want to talk with them, share with them, and accept them as brothers and sisters. The new evangelization offers an opportunity for the Church to engage in conversation and to invite back our brothers and sisters who have drifted away. The study in Trenton highlighted the need for this conversation, a dialogue, not simply a restatement of the rules, a true engagement of the person. So when they're engaged simply by having these exit interviews, they feel connected again with the Church. There's a conversation that was restarted or rekindled that they didn't experience before. And that in and of itself could be a form of invitation back to the Church because they're feeling connected, they're feeling heard. And if the bishop acts on some of those recommendations, how much more so will they then feel connected back to the Church? And so that's an invitational process, an invitation that starts rekindling the active faith life. But it needs to start with that conversation. Often these conversations are best done through witness, testimony, and personal experience that contain both intellectual and an emotional appeal, not simply a rational explanation or recitation of the doctrine. The new evangelization also requires the creative and effective use of all the church's resources. A constitutive strategy for the success of each of these initiatives is the creation of effective communication systems that reach all Catholics. Initiatives will have to be creatively engaging diverse Catholic communities and should foster the support and renewal of Catholic leaders. Special efforts need to be made to reach young people and those who have drifted from the practice of their faith. Today's research indicates that the communication strategy should not simply be the church sharing her message, but should also include the ability of people to respond to that message. So it's not a one-way communication, but a two-way communication, where the message can be shared and then feedback can be heard, and this dialogue can bear much fruit. New means of social communication provide that resource readily, as you mentioned, emails, but also social media, Facebook. There's a real back and forth, where there can be a true conversation that can take place. And we've seen a number of bishops now starting blogs and all the different responses that yields. And so there's a real opportunity for dialogue to take place through social means of communication. Some of the recent papal statements on the new evangelization that over the past years have provided a real sketch and direction for the new evangelization. 10 years after the close of the Second Vatican Council and a year after the 1974 Synod of Bishops, Pope Paul VI's Apostolic Exhortation on Evangelization in the Modern World provides the foundational document on evangelization. The Pope stated, "The Church exists in order to evangelize, that is to say, in order to preach and teach, to be a channel of the gift of peace, to reconcile sinners to God, and to perpetuate Christ's sacrifice in the Mass, which is the memorial of his death and glorious resurrection." Communicating these core beliefs and teachings is going to be essential in the new evangelization, to do it in such a way that people can hear it, understand it, and grapple with those key issues. The challenge of the new evangelization in the United States is to revitalize the very core of the Church's mission to evangelize. This involves Catholics identifying themselves as missionaries, people who share the good news that they've received with others. Sharing one's faith means Catholics will be countercultural, going against the American culture that often encourages religion as a private affair or not to be discussed publicly. It involves equipping Catholics to proclaim the kingdom of God to their family, their friends, and their neighbors, by fostering a desire within them to bear witness to God's revelation. It involves equipping them to have these conversations and this dialogue, which means an understanding of their faith, not simply to just state a doctrine at someone, but to be able to really explain that doctrine, to explain the teaching and why they believe Mass is important, why they believe in the different teachings of the faith. Dr. Dingus's research also indicates there's a need for a more robust catechesis to help Catholics not only increase their knowledge of the faith, but help them articulate that faith for others. The research indicates that one of the clearest means to transmit the faith and to keep people connected to the Church is through the family. So the family and marriage and family will be an essential aspect of the new evangelization. Stable families with both a loving mother and a father who are practicing Catholics tend to have children who stay active in the Church, even if they drift away at some point in their life. Dr. Dingus highlighted that close emotional bonds with one's parents help children live out their parents' religious preference and influences their daily actions and their choices. The research shows that having close relationship with a mother and a father bears positive results, including other surveys that talk about staying in school, doing better in school, less likely to take drugs, things along those lines. Fostering a healthy marriage and family culture is vital. The new evangelization also calls attention to those who have heard the initial proclamation of the gospel, yet the message was not fully received and did not take effect in the person's life, which is exactly the population we're talking about today, those who are lapsed or disaffiliated. This symposium is referring to lapsed Catholics, those who are baptized and probably even received initial catechesis, but have not persisted in the practice of their Catholic faith. A clear, relevant, engaging presentation of the faith is needed that addresses people's sincere questions. As Father Byron and Dr. Zeck's research shows, this catechesis also involves a dialogue and not a mere recitation of the rules. Reasoned arguments and better pastoral explanations on Catholic doctrine and practice are an essential aspect of the new evangelization. This catechesis will necessarily involve an element of evangelization. The modern person, especially young people, are more used to sensory stimulating engagement with their iPads and iPhones. They respond immediately to incoming information through texts and calls. Catechesis need not completely change in light of this, but must be aware of how the modern person experiences or perhaps expects a presentation of the faith. The Holy Father called for a new ardor, methods, and expression of evangelization, concepts that will engage the present-day culture and the modern-day man. Often this newness includes the use of modern means of communication and social media. Social media offers a new opportunity for creativity and innovation so that all Catholics, including lapsed Catholics, can experience the gospel anew. It also has the ability to reach a population of people that homilies, church bulletins, and pulpit announcements will never reach. Typically, if the church wants to get the word out, they'll go through the bulletin, and our lapsed brothers and sisters will never receive that. Homilies, they'll never hear that. And so we have to think of creative ways. Social media will be one aspect, ways of reaching lapsed Catholics that other avenues may not have reached. It'd be interesting to talk more about how, in your different ways of soliciting respondents, how you reach some others, if social media was a part of that outreach or not. We can talk about that later. Pope Benedict clearly is aware of the challenges facing the Church when he created the Pontifical Council for promoting new evangelization. He stated in the creation of the Pontifical Council, abandonment of faith, a phenomenon progressively more manifest in societies and cultures which for centuries seem to be permeated by the gospel. The Holy Father clarified that the new evangelization is new, not in its content, but rather in its inner thrust, new in its methods that must correspond to the times, and new because it's necessary to proclaim the gospel to those who have already heard it. The new evangelization is not a single formula meant for all circumstances, but rather first and foremost a profound experience of God. As we've heard today, that the reasons people have left the church or disaffiliated are variety and wide, and the new evangelization must address each of those in different and unique ways. It's not a one program, it's not one formula that's going to solve all these problems. The content of the faith remains the same, but how that content is shared, especially with those who've heard it before, is vital. New methods to correspond with how people receive information and enter into a relationship today is key. Younger generations enter into relationship through different formats and different methods than we're used to in former times. These methods may offer familiar means of communication with life-changing message and a relationship with Christ. The new evangelization cannot be reduced to purely outward activity either. In fact, the new evangelization, as seen in the lineamenta for the upcoming Synod of Bishops, calls for and requires introspection by both the universal church and individually by her members. The research today offers material for deeper reflection and discernment. The lineamenta is clear. The new evangelization is not simply doing more of the same. Discernment, as also called for by Dr. Dingus, is needed. What has worked? What's not working? What new opportunities are present for the church to share the good news of Jesus Christ need to be discerned. I would also add to that, what's turning people off? What has caused them to leave? When you get a direct report back, and the bishop's going to potentially follow up with a phone call, that can be directly addressed and the situation can be talked about. Responding to those genuine needs. Communal and personal reflection can lead to an internal renewal and a renewed passion to live and share the gospel. Without a deeper and meaningful relationship with Christ, a person's witness may be ineffective, may lack a freshness or vigor that inspires others. People seek authentic witnesses to live out the faith rather than just someone who teaches about the faith. A happy and cheerful countenance will attract more than a dour or arrogant attitude. This is clearly evident in Father Byron and Dr. Zeck's research in Trenton. The effects of parish clergy and staff, members appearing aloof or disinterested to people's needs, is evident. It's important for all Catholics to realize that we're always to be welcoming and receptive to people's questions and their concerns. Simply being friendly can go a long way in the new evangelization. And finally, what are some new initiatives in the new evangelization? Data such as being presented today provides an assessment of the current cultural context in which the new evangelization is taking place. It will target ways to help implement the new evangelization and renew the faith life of Catholics. To help foster the new evangelization, the Bishop's Committee on Evangelization and Catechesis is developing an online resource, Disciples Called to Witness. This interactive website provides an overview and resource for the new evangelization in the United States. The new evangelization takes on many and varied initiatives to engage the diverse cultures in the United States. The new evangelization is also an opportunity to help Catholics realize the immense value and necessity of the sacraments, and to recognize that through baptism they've been called to be Christ's witnesses to the world. Knowing that baptism, confirmation, and Eucharist sustains and strengthens our faith, provide the grace needed to be a disciple, will help foster a desire to evangelize. Father Byron and Dr. Zeck also indicate the immediate need for a fresh explanation of the Eucharist, and why attending Mass each week is an important opportunity to give thanks to God through sacrament and sacrifice. Simply saying that weekly attendance is required is not enough. Understanding the deeper meaning of the Mass, how it impacts one's life, and why regular worship is a response to God's initiating love for us can help Catholics realize why the Mass is so important. With a renewed faith in Christ and His Church, Catholics can boldly proclaim the faith to a modern culture. Given the current cultural context of society in the United States, the Church in a particular way is directing her evangelization efforts to those members of the body of Christ who are absent. New evangelization challenges us to reach out to our missing brothers and sisters by inviting them to return to the sacraments, and by asking them why they no longer feel welcomed at the Lord's table, as the research today showed. Today's symposium offers a rich contribution to this ongoing discussion. In conclusion, I'd like to just mention again some of the aspects of the new evangelization highlighted in the research, which include opportunities for personal and communal renewal of faith and confidence in the gospel, and ongoing reflection and discernment. A robust catechesis that includes engaging presentations on the faith and dialogue. I would also add to that some of the research you mentioned today in your conversations, including the Catholic Church's social teachings, which seem to come up several times throughout comments, as well as the moral issues that are continually questions. A sacramental catechesis, especially on the Mass and the Eucharist, renewing marriage and family life, strengthening Catholic identity, pastoral faithfulness and creativity in sharing the faith, fostering welcoming and engaging parishes, and finally fostering a desire to share the good news of Jesus Christ and to welcome back our brothers and sisters in the faith who have drifted away. Today's symposium can be viewed as a unique contribution to the new evangelization. Dr. Dingus, Father Byron, Dr. Zeck, thank you so much for having me and inviting me to today's symposium.
But there was no sense, at least I'm talking about my own experience growing up, there was no sense of the social dimension of the Eucharist. There was no sense that when you receive the bread of life, you should share the bread for life, and that should be part of your parish life. There was none of that. You know, you went to communion and you received communion. Now we're living in a new environment where that old understanding of the Eucharist, to however unsophisticated it may have been theologically, doesn't make any difference. Now it's time to get a new understanding, an enlightened view of the Eucharist, and to make that a dynamic force. And if the new evangelization doesn't come up with a creative way of catechizing people on the nature of the Eucharist, it will be a failure. Sacraments effect what they signify. Now, if the Eucharist does not effect union and communion, which it signifies, it'll be a failure. So when we turn that altar around and we got everybody together and say, you know, whether you're strumming guitars and all, but you're a community, and and it didn't work, we were putting a lot on the line with the new vernacular and all of that sort of thing, rather than making. I have a Jewish, an intellectual, a friend, and she said to me, it was right right before Vatican II, right during Vatican II, when she said, "You're blowing all the candles out. You're taking the mystery out of it. You're taking the magic out of it. Be careful. You're blowing all the candles out."
Just to mention brief, Amy, you mentioned focolare, and Father, you mentioned effective means to evangelize and catechize, and bringing the two together. The Holy Father, when he had a meeting in Rome on the new evangelizers for the new evangelization, he brought together a lot of the new movements and ecclesial communities, particularly to highlight the fact how they do evangelize and catechize and create this sense of Catholic identity among themselves. And you mentioned how that's somewhat separate from hooking your faith dependent upon a priest or an individual. But it's not dependent upon. Exactly. You make it your own. Make the faith your own. Right.
Yeah, my name is Ken Holland. I am a Labs Catholic. I went to St. Michael's over here. They're closing down actually in Silver Spring at the end of this semester. My question is actually for Professor Zek, which is, being in the communications business, I'm fascinated by the idea of using exit interviews or polling or focus groups. You would use that in any business that was, was having problems with their product. I guess my question is now that you've got this information, do you have any indication from Bishop O'Connell or any others that they're going to use this in any way to try to change the quality of the priests? If the priests are the mini CEOs, the division heads of each of these parishes, you're not going to do Six Sigma and fire the 10% that are underperforming. But nowadays, with people expecting, whether it's ratemyprofessor.com or people expecting using social media and wanting a dialogue, the days of just doing it the way you wanted to, because that's the way it's always been, those are over. They've been over for a long time. So I'm just curious if you have any idea whether once different dioceses have this information, if they're going to make any changes. A kind comment to a priest about refusing to do a funeral for a 9-year-old because it wasn't a Catholic cemetery. For me, that's unacceptable. That it needs to be more than that if that person's ever going to change and wake up. So I'm just curious.
From a church management perspective, I've long argued we have to evaluate our priests, evaluate our pastors. All of us go through evaluation of our positions. Very few, if any, priests do. So the first step is a formal evaluation process that includes 360-degree, the parishioners and the staff and everyone else that's connected. And if priests knew they're being evaluated, we may not have these sort of things come up as the abuse we were talking about today.
I sometimes say there's not a shortage of priests, there's a shortage of celebrants. Go ahead, 1 and then 2.
Problem with clergy, we're dissatisfied with our clergy for different reasons. And it seems like the solutions that are offered are more like, educate us a little bit more. But have the new evangelization looked into the seminarian education? Like, can it be changed, improved? What about the formation of clergy?
It has enormous implications for seminary education. Enormous.
But I mean, planned already, something that's planned. We understand, obviously, I imply that we should change something in that department too, but any practical steps, any kind of programs or any discussions going about, is everything okay and are we satisfied with our seminary education, or is there something that needs to be improved?
Working in evangelization and catechesis, I don't deal directly with that too much. I know it's reviewed regularly, and I know as far as the conference goes, one thing that they're definitely looking at, and that was highlighted in the studies, is preaching. That the quality and effectiveness and ways preaching can be improved is definitely being looked at and discussed and being talked about. But yes, seminary formation is essential because that's the future of the church. It's the future of the clergy. And so how they're formed sets the tone for what happens in the parish. So it's definitely an important aspect.
Go ahead.
Just to kind of contextualize things and piggybacking on what Tom said, the priests that are out there active right now, average age is 64. They were trained, formed, and ordained in a previous generation. They were the vast bulk of them were ordained in the 60s and 70s. They were in a different seminary formation. Yes, the new seminaries, the new PPF, the priest program of priestly formation is vastly different. And yes, the younger seminarians are being trained very differently than the ones that were before. But the issue is that the real problem here, the elephant in the room, as Tom mentioned, is the fact that there's not quite as many priests as parishes right now available. And in many dioceses, there's maybe 100 parishes and at best 100 live bodies to cover those parishes. In other dioceses, there's 100 parishes and there's only 80 priests left. And, the average age is still 64. And that means within the next 10 years, they're going to have 40 priests to handle those 100 parishes. That's the demographic mismatch that is sort of underlying a lot of this. It's not just are we offering the right product that's attractive to lay people, but it's also the other end of the marketing, the supply end, is drying up, and that's a big issue. That's a big problem.
I'm going to piggyback on a couple of these comments here, but I just want to ask, at the present time, has the seminarian enrollment increased, decreased, or stayed the same?
Stayed the same over the past 15 years.
It's what?
Stayed the same over the past 15 years, and only about a third as many being ordained each year as are necessary to make up for the numbers that are dying, retiring, leaving.
Okay, and the reason they're not being ordained is because they're leaving?
No.
They're just staying as... Yeah. Oh, okay. So my point being is that if the seminarians what is the percentage? In other words, are there enough seminarians that are coming into the church that would correct the problems that we can have?
No.
Let's call it a farm system from a baseball standpoint. We have a farm system. What is it that has to be done?
The problem is what happened in the 40s and 50s and 60s. The large numbers that came in precisely because of what Bill Byron was talking about, the ghetto Catholicism that created this wonderful culture of looking up to the priesthood from an ethnic immigrant perspective. The priesthood is up on a pedestal. That's a white-collar job compared to the blue-collar jobs that are available to Catholics. That time is not like the time that we're in right now. The attractions that led young men to become priests are very different now than they were in the ghetto Catholicism.
So is it
Just
a
a
sign
couple
of
of comments and we'll
purification?
go back there. The spectacle of
Happy men doing useful work is going to attract others to want to come into the priesthood. That evidence is not out there right now. The other thing, the Holy Spirit has a lot to do with this. And the exclusion of married men and the exclusion of women from ordination also has a lot to do with it. They are institutional barriers. Now, if you believe, as you read in the Gospels, that nothing is impossible with God, how can you maintain that it is impossible to have a married clergy or women ordained in the Roman Catholic community? It may not happen. And you may even argue it should not happen. But to say it cannot happen, it's impossible, seems to me to fly in the face of a theological reality that nothing is impossible with God. So the Holy Spirit may be nudging us through a lot of the difficulties that we're experiencing, maybe trying to break through. And we may be stifling the Spirit by our resistance to respond.
Here is one, poor preparation and pastoral care. Partially, that may well be more of a management issue insofar as a number of the clergy in a number of these locales, Trenton being one of them as far as I'm aware, are often given either multiple parish situations as a single individual. And we can give the possibilities in terms of how to deal with that. But I think when pastoral preparation is considered in a number of seminary settings as somewhat of an addendum or something I have to kind of suffer through rather than a central aspect. And secondly, management is certainly not something, there's not enough time for it. We can't fit it into the program. We get to it later. As long as those two attitudes are prevalent within presbyteral formation, then these types of issues will continue because you're dealing with men who are overburdened often, sometimes who then feel entitlement as a result of that overburden, and decide then that they're going to, well, I'm owed this because I'm overburdened. But part of it has to do with balance that's not necessarily been named and prevalent within their formative program. So I think in both of those areas, that becomes certainly a challenge, but also an opportunity, and certainly an opportunity for an expansion of ministry, particularly lay ministry.
Good comment.
I was just thinking that 5 years ago I did a study of home mission dioceses in the United States, where these shortages are even more critical. And I remember one priest in particular that I interviewed who was doing, if you will, the liturgy something like 7 and 8 times a weekend. Mm-hmm. And his life had been reduced essentially to that of a kind of ever-ready bunny sacramental functionary. I mean, quite literally, going from one place.
You're a sacramental Pez dispenser.
Yeah, very much. And I saw this little sort of nervous breakdown.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what ministerial could have meant to him under those circumstances, other than. I agree with the remark about, in the sense of the church becoming a more lay-centered church and so forth. But I think, too, that we should recognize that the kinds of things that were described negatively in relationship to priests, vis-a-vis arrogance and pride and being insensitive, and lay people are not exempt from that. And the idea that because it's going to become a more lay-centered church, therefore it's going to be more. It ain't necessarily so. No. So I just think we should be sensitive to that. Okay, so listen. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for being here. Anyone want a last word? Or okay, there are treats.